All right, so we're starting a new series this morning. It's called Not Just Child's Play. We're going to look at five messages over the next month, and all these are messages that we typically teach our kids. So we're going to look at the story of Noah and the ark. We're going to look at the story of David and Goliath. We're going to look at the story of Jonah and the big fish. We're going to look at the story of Jonah and his, Joseph and his colorful coat. And this morning we're going to look at this really fun story about these three boys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, these aren't just child stories. In fact, sometimes I think that we make them child stories so we don't have to encounter the truth that they're trying to speak to us. These stories are anything but child's stories. They apply to all of us, children of all ages. So let's start off with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So once upon a time, there was these three young men. Their names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, they worked for the Babylonian civil service. They were Jews, and they were pretty good Jews at that. So as a Jewish person, they would have believed in one God and one God alone. And they would have known him as Yahweh. Now, they worked for a guy with a funny name. Does anybody know his name? Nebuchadnezzar would be his name. How do you like to have that name? Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar was a king, and he liked being a king more than he liked being the people. He liked the power, he liked the status, he liked the control that went along with being a king. So then one day, Nebuchadnezzar decided that he was going to build a 9-story idol made out of 24-karat gold. So that was quite a feat thousands of years ago, and it was no small endeavor for sure. And when it was done, Nebuchadnezzar was very proud of his creation. In fact, he was so proud of his creation that he posted a picture of it on MySpace. It was the first social network that was around in ancient Babylon, like 7,000 years ago. And what he said in the caption is that I demand that everybody, when the music plays, gets on your knees and worships this idol, this statue that I have created. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were not overly impressed with this statue, and they filled out some paperwork to become conscientious objectors to worshiping this what they would have considered a big totem pole on steroids. Now Nebuchadnezzar, he called them in and he says, guys, you're going to have to worship this thing, or I'm going to throw you into this great big fiery furnace. And they wouldn't budge. So Nebuchadnezzar, he sent out his flunkies to go gather some of the oldest, hardest wood that they could possibly find. He heated up the furnace to 7 times its normal temperature. And then what happened, it wasn't part of the plan. It wasn't part of the plan at all. Nebuchadnezzar was sitting front row center, and he saw all this unfold. So the fire was so hot that the men, Nebuchadnezzar's friends, that threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, it was so hot that they got burned, and they died. They just burned away to a crisp. Now, what happened next wasn't part of the plan either. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the fiery furnace, and there's 2 things that surprised Nebuchadnezzar. He looked into the fire, and there weren't 3 people in the fire. There was 4 people in the fire. And he didn't know that these 4 people were going to be fireproof. So Nebuchadnezzar, he's like freaking out, and he calls the people out of the fire. There's only 3 men that emerge, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Their eyebrows aren't even singed. They walk out without a scratch in their body. And Nebuchadnezzar, he's like, well, your God, Yahweh, I'm actually pretty impressed, and I'm going to start worshiping him now, and I'm going to recommend that everybody else do the same. So this is the wonderful story. It's a story that we tell our kids. It's a story about faith. Like, there's this obvious thing that, God is with us as we walk through the fires of life. But we're going to look at 3 other lessons that Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and in the end, Nebuchadnezzar can teach us. Now, lesson number one is that putting God first is not always the easy choice. All right, so this applies to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it applies to us as well. Putting God first isn't always the easy choice. So Nebuchadnezzar, he was not a Jew. He lived in Babylonia, which like today we would call like modern day Iraq. It was common to create idols and worship them. And the Bible says that this statue, this totem pole, was going to be 60 cubits high by 6 cubits wide. So really, we're talking 100 feet high and 10 feet wide. Now, you might be thinking, like, why would anybody, worship this great big totem pole that was created by a person? Like, you think, oh, that's dumb. Like, why would we worship this great big thing that he's created? Now, you might think it's dumb, but we do this all the time. There's things out there that, like, we worship, and if we take a step back, we think, why is it that we worship these things? So if you look at the first couple commandments, like, God specifically says, like, you should have no other God before me. If you ask Jesus, like, what the most important commandment, he says you should love God with all your heart and your soul and your mind and your strength. But I've come up with, like, 10 modern-day idols. And, I'm not, like, throwing any of these things under the bus because all these things have the potential to be good, but at an excess, they can be an idol. And when something becomes an idol, it gets in the way between us and God. When something gets in the way between us and God, all of a sudden our life doesn't seem to make as much sense as what it used to. So number one on my list is money. Money can do a lot of really cool things, but money can't do the most important things. Money can be a great resource, but money is a terrible god. I know people that have sacrificed so much time and so much energy and so much emotional health, serving a God that ultimately is going to disappoint in the end. Number two would be a related thing, possessions. Humanity's creation will become outdated and obsolete. Like, we're not created to be consumers. We are created to be full participants in the kingdom of God. Now, number three would be power. Now, wouldn't it be really cool if everybody had to listen to everything that you said and they would have to do exactly what you said and how you said it? Wouldn't that be really cool? Well, it would be cool in the short term, but it wouldn't be cool in the long term. Because you can't have, like, true intimacy with someone that you have power over. You just can't have it. We're not created to use humans. We are created to love and to be loved. Great leaders are servants, and it's when we serve that we look most like Jesus. Number four is a God that some of us serve is perfectionism. Some of us serve this God of perfectionism, and for all perfectionism's possibilities, in the grand scheme of things, she's going to be a very cruel companion. A perfectionist is not defined as someone who does things perfectly. The best definition of a perfectionist is somebody who works relentlessly because they fear rejection and failure. So here's the problem with perfectionism. There's always going to be an unmet expectation. The expectation of a perfectionist is that I always do things right. I do them on time. But, like, we're imperfect people, and it's impossible to pull that off. So there's always going to be this unmet expectation in our life because we can't be perfect all the time. And when we can't be perfect all the time and on time, it creates this thing called stress. And stress is not God's plan for our life. Many of us, we idolize this God of perfectionism. And we got to stop doing that. Now, number five is sex. So I think lust is like the craving of salt for a person who's dying of thirst. Like, we're looking for approval. We're looking for a short-term self-medication in the wrong place. It just doesn't work forever. Number six is love. So, like, here, like, we put our hopes in another person. That's great. I mean, we talk about relationships all the time here. Like we want healthy, authentic, growing, flourishing, life-giving relationships where both parties are blessed. But when we elevate another person to like this godlike status, what we're doing is we're placing the weight on their shoulders of all these expectations that that person is never fully going to be able to do. So now all of a sudden we have two people who are disappointed. Number 7 is sports. Now I like sports as much as the next person. Yeah, I've run the Boston Marathon. I've coached a youth soccer team for years. Yeah, I don't generally miss a Green Bay Packers game. But here's the deal. Like, here's the deal. If Americans put as much time and energy worshiping and serving God, loving our fellow neighbor as we did into sports, we would be a lot better off, wouldn't we? Sports is great. It's a pastime. It's not so great as a God. Number 8 is approval. If your God is pleasing a bunch of imperfect people, good luck with that. It's just not going to happen. This God will wear you down and it will spit you out. Number 9 is pleasure. Leisure and pleasure, I actually hope that you experience some of it today. I hope you experience a lot of it today. These are really good things, but they're lousy gods. And the last one is self. Now, you're not the center of the universe. You're going to discover this in one of two ways, either proactively or reactively. Let's discover this one proactively and realize that God is the creator of the universe, that we are his beloved child, that we are a brother and a sister to Jesus Christ, and live life through that lens. Now, when we seek hope and joy and meaning in a created thing, the idol will always overpromise and underdeliver. And we will experience disappointment and dissatisfaction because things like hope and joy and meaning, they only come from the Creator. So I'll go back to an idol that I once had. I want to show you a picture of my first car. So that's my first car. I bought this car in 1990. I was 20 years old at the time. I'll just save those of you who are trying to do the math in your head. I'm 48. So this was a 1981 Volvo 240DL. Now I paid, I think it was $2,800 for this car. Now as a 20-year-old college student, first car I've ever owned. I didn't have one before this. So this car was going to absolutely revolutionize my life. Like this car, I had arrived. I had a car. So I was going to be able to go out on dates without like saying, do you want to walk down to Domino's and get a pizza? Like I could actually drive her somewhere. I could drive to work. I could have freedom. Like I could go places now where I couldn't do that before. Now, what I did with this car is I spent my life savings on something that I would say was just pretty much okay. For some reason, the stuff with the girl still didn't work out. The car didn't help one bit. I actually missed like the 15-minute walk to work. I walked from the college campus to the grocery store and back, and I missed that time. I never really experienced much freedom because I was always working, so I could pay the car insurance and the gas and the repairs. So I called this car Sparky. That was its name. I owned Sparky for about 10 years. Finally, I think it was in 2000, I actually gave the car away, like to the Kidney Foundation. They just took it away. Like it had 280,000 miles. I was just sick of driving it. So all of a sudden, like this one thing was going to give me hope. It was going to give me meaning. It was going to give me a purpose. And I spent my entire life savings pretty much on this one thing, and it was just okay. And I think there's a lot of other people in this room that have had like buyer's regret on one thing or another in our life that was going to give us hope and meaning and purpose, and it just didn't do that. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, he offered a god to these 3 young men. Now, he already knew they knew something that he didn't know. So here's the king, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew something that Nebuchadnezzar didn't know, and that is that idols will always overpromise and underdeliver. So Nebuchadnezzar, he talked to these boys, and they said, "We already got a God. His name's Yahweh. He's the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob." And then the king, he called him into his office, and he says, y'all need to bow down to my statue, or I'm going to throw you into this furnace. So let's pick up the dialogue in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you." Isn't that really cool? So you got these three guys, they're probably like 20 years old. They all work for the government. They're in the palace of the king. And the king is saying, like, you guys need to do this, or I'm going to throw you into this furnace. And they're like, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. We already got a God. We got a king, and it's not a king with a small k like you. It's a king with a big K, and his name's Yahweh. So then verse 17, it says, if we're thrown, like, I just love like how bold these three boys are. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. So the conversation goes like this. Okay, king, you got some power. We get that. But we believe that our God has a lot more power than you'll ever have. You've wasted all these resources on this dumb totem pole. You did that. You created that great big totem pole, and that's really cool. But you know what our God did? When our people were being chased by the Egyptian army, what our God did is he stopped a river dead in its tracks, and he let us escape into our promised land. That's what our God did. There was a day that we were fighting, and the day was about ready to be done, and our God stopped the sun in the sky. And there was a day that the sun stood still because our people needed to be victorious, and they were. Do you really think that throwing us into this furnace is a threat to us? You're the king with the little k. We got a king with the big K, and his name's Yahweh. Now, this next line is probably one of my favorite lines in the whole Bible. I had forgot it was in here. I was reading the story this week. I love it. So they just said, our God's going to rescue us. But listen to what they say next. But even if he doesn't, so these three young guys are in front of the king. Can you imagine how bold they are? He says, even if he doesn't, we want to make it perfectly clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the God statue that you've set up. Isn't that bold and courageous? They don't care. They know that their God is there for them. Now, the lesson is that putting God first is not always an easy choice. Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, they were probably about 50-50 on where their barbecue was in their future. And they were actually the subject of the barbecue. It's not easy for us either, though, to put God first. And we don't have to compete against Nebuchadnezzar, but we do have to compete against the culture that we live in. Now, some of us, we've been worshiping our kids' sports. Some of us, we worship getting approval from other people. Some of us think that buying our next product is what is going to give us meaning in life. It's tough to put God first. I get that. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they get that. But when we do put God first, what we're going to uncover is hope and joy and meaning, because these things ultimately only come from the Creator and not the creation. Now, the second lesson from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is our anger can cause devastating consequences for us and the people who are around us. Let's take a poll real quick. Does anybody here know anybody that just doesn't deal with their anger very well? Just show of hands. Yeah, so a lot of us, we know people that just don't deal with their anger very well. And I actually saw someone's hand being raised up. Hate to be that person after church. Maybe if they listen to the next 3 minutes here, we'll be good to go. Do you know, who gets hurt really bad with the anger? It's usually not the subject of the anger. It's usually like the person who's angry and the person who's angry and their loved ones. So let's go to Daniel chapter 3, verse 19. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious. So they just said what I just read. Like they just said, it doesn't matter if he doesn't. We're still not going to, worship your, dumb pole you've made here. So Nebuchadnezzar, he's so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times as usual. So here, anger is a natural emotion. Like anger happens. Like there's nothing that you can do not to get angry. In fact, angry is it can be a good thing sometimes. So anger is a natural emotion, but it's what we do with that anger, that gets us. So let's just say that you don't deal with your anger very well. You just kind of keep it bottled inside. And, what Mark Twain said is anger is an acid that can do more harm to the vessel in which it is stored than to anything on which it is poured. Anger will mess you up. If you don't deal with your anger well, it will mess us up. A poor response to anger is ultimately going to hurt the person who's angry. What it's like. Anger is basically like getting into a sports car. You test out the fast engine, the fast turning. Then all of a sudden you realize the brakes don't work. That's what anger is. Now, anger has another negative function as well. Not only hurts the person who's angry, and we see this in the story, it hurts the person who's around the person who's angry. So Shakespeare says, men in rage strike those that wish them best. So, if you've read Othello, the context in which that comes, usually the victim of our anger is like one of the persons that we care about the most. We find that in the story. In verse 22, and because the king, in his anger, demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. So let's just say, like on Thursday, someone went and bought gas at Costco at 100 and Giles, 120th in that area, and he was trying to get back to his house at 173rd and Harrison, and it was about 5 o'clock, and he thought to himself, I'll just take Giles Road, not a problem. Oh, I can't take Giles Road, it's closed, so I'll have to get on Harrison. Then you get to 144th and Harrison, it's closed. So I could go back to Giles, but the problem there is 168th Street is closed. So I'll go up to Q Street. And I went up to he went up to Q Street. And every other car in Omaha was on Q Street at that time. And I got back home 3 hours later to 173rd and Harrison. My gas tank was empty. I was furious. So what do I do here? Do I go home and take it out on the family? Or do I say, okay, that was a miserable trip. Not the best idea I've ever had. But the people in this house deserve better than my current state, so I'm going to leave this stuff in the car. If you've had a bad day at work and you go home, your people deserve better. Leave it at work. If you've had a bad day at school and your teacher wasn't fair to you, that wasn't your parents' fault, so be kind to them. Don't let your anger hurt the people that you love the most. So here's the 2 steps. You get mad, number 1. Step number 2 is you just get over it. All right, one more lesson. God is with us when we walk through the fires of life. So in verse 24 and 25, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, why weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire? They replied, certainly, Your Majesty. And he said, look, I see 4 men who are walking around the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th one looks like a son of the gods. So here's the deal on this one. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew something that Nebuchadnezzar didn't know. These people would have read the Bible. They knew in Isaiah chapter 43, verse 2 and 3, the prophet speaking on God's behalf says something like this: "When you walk through the fires of life, I will be with you." The flames, they will not overcome you. They won't consume you because I'm your God. I am the God of Israel. I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So when they walked into the fiery furnace, they knew that promise. And the promise that Jesus makes to all of us is that he is going to be with us. So at the end of his life, Jesus, what he did is he took the bread, and he was sitting with his 12 disciples. And Jesus, he took the bread, and he broke it, and he blessed it, and he said, "Friends, this is my body that is given for you. When you eat of this, do so in remembrance of me." And likewise, later in the meal, Jesus took the wine, he blessed it, and he said, "Friends, this is my blood. It's the blood that has been given for you in the forgiveness of your sins. When you eat of this, do so in remembrance of me." I was thinking, what we get to remember. What we can remember this morning when we take the bread is that after his resurrection, we celebrated Easter. We celebrated Easter last week. At the end of the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "And remember that I am with you always until the end of the age." During those good times when there's celebration, he's with us. During those hardships and the difficult times, he is with us. During those average, ordinary days, he is with us because God has always been with God's people. God was always with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Even when things seemed hopeless, God never was away from them. When David was looking up against the great big Philistine giant Goliath, with fear in his eyes, he knew that his God was with him. When Ruth was all alone, when she was abandoned, when things were hopeless for her, she always knew, this Moabite woman knew that he was with her. When Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego walked into the fiery furnace, they knew that their God was with them and they were in his hands. When Mary became pregnant with the Son of God and she knew that public shaming was in her future, she was filled with joy because she knew that God was with her. When Paul found himself face down in the sand, when Paul was persecuted, when Paul was stoned to death, he knew that God was with him because God has always been with God's people. For some of us, we might be going through something like cancer. For some of us, we might be going through a painful ending to a relationship. For some of us, we might be going through financial hardships. For some of us, we might see our kids hurting, and that hurts us. But to all of us, God is with us. God is with us when we walk through the fires of life, and he promises us that the flames, they will not consume us because he is our God.